All right then, friends. So we already have seen how to design collections into our project. We created two data files to represent our two collections and defined the properties of each collection by specifying the data type and variable name. And we are able to create an Isar collection by importing the Isar package. Now I want to show you how to introduce ID and indexes to the collections, but first, let's define what they are. All right. So let's take an example of a country. A country consists of citizens. Each citizen is provided with a specific document called an ID document. And everyone has an ID document, but what makes each document unique is the ID number that's in that document. That ID number is the one that uniquely identifies a citizen in that specific country. That's basically what ID is also in databases. It's a property that we create that uniquely identifies an item in a collection. So when you're creating a data object, for example, these three routines that we have will be data objects. They need to be uniquely identified. And currently there's no specific property that uniquely identifies it. So that's what we're going to do in the project, create a property called ID. Isar identifies ID as a unique property, but there are some things we'll need to add to actually provide that information to Isar. So that means that once we add the ID property, these three routines will have a specific uniqueness to them. So for example, you can have this routine having an ID called 1, an ID called 2 on the next one, so they can increment. So you can use auto increment on IDs just like in basic database. Now let's head over to the project and add our IDs. So here we are back again. So we're going to add the ID property on routine category and also on the routine collection and also in the category collection. So for the routine collection, how we enter an ID or set a unique property called ID is by specifying the data type, which will always be an integer, calling it ID. Just like the same way we created other properties, we do the same thing, but now we have to provide it or annotate it. So we'll annotate it with the word ID. So Isar will identify this as a unique property. But now there are three ways to actually assign an ID. First one is if you want to set your own IDs, maybe you have a function where that generates unique IDs and you want to be passing it, make sure you add this to your ID. So you're telling Isar, hey, do not auto increment for me or do not do anything on this property. I have it handled somewhere and I'll be passing a unique number on this property. That's one way. The second way is we can actually set this ID as is, because Isar has a way to identify the word ID and connect it with the ID annotation. But another way is you can set it like that or also assign it by saying Isar dot auto increment. That's one way you can use the ID name itself. You can either leave it without assigning or assign it. That's the second way. The third way is where you do not want to use the word ID per se, because sometimes for best practices in databases, you might want to call it routine ID. When you set your variable name, your unique property as routine ID, Isar won't be able to know or identify this name. So assigning it to Isar.autoincrement is a must. It's not like the previous one where you just write ID. If you specify a specific name for your unique property, you must add this so that it knows that you want it to increment for you, other than the fact that you have annotated it. So for us, we're going to use ID basically, and that's that. So let's do the same thing for the category collection. We come here and set the data type as int ID, then we annotate it at ID, and then we assign it. And we're done. And we have added IDs on our collections. That means when a routine that object is created, it will be provided for a unique ID. Same for category, it will be provided for a unique ID. So you can identify a specific that object with a unique ID. And that's that. Now let's introduce indexes. In Isar, there are different types of indexes, but we will focus on 4. So there's a default index. We'll go through a scenarios to make it easier for you to understand, and then we'll see how we're going to incorporate it into our project. So we have what an index basically is. It's a data structure that is used to retrieve records from a database very fast. It's just another way of actually organizing your database in a way that if you want to retrieve information, you retrieve it fast. Because the situations where when you want to retrieve data, you find that it consumes a lot of resources, it affects the performance as well. But if you use practices like using indexes in your data tables, in your tables or collections, in this case, it helps you retrieve data faster. So first index, we have the default index. I have a very simple, let me remove this first. This is a simple collection of records, which shows items and the prices. So you find that if I use default index here, how it will organize the records will be something like this. So it uses we are trying to say we have set the default index on the price property. So what it does is that it organizes its data in an ascending order and presents the data in this format. The beauty of this is, for example, if I want to get the item with the lowest price, instead of creating a long set of code that actually loops through or checks every single record, I already know my work, the records have been sorted or arranged. So I know the lowest has to be at the top. So I can just pick, if it was an array, I could just pick index 0, which is the first one. And that's less code and high performance than going through every single record looking for the lowest item. So that's the beauty of indexes, and that's how we use the default index. So the second index is a composite index. This happens, it performs the same way as a default index, but the difference is that unlike default index that uses one column or one property, composite index can use 2. You may want to be checking 2 columns or 3 columns of data together at the same time. When you're looking at age, you also want to check, okay, at this age, which job role does this person have? So if you want to do that, you can actually add an index on the specific column that you're interested in. In our case, we put age we set the age property with a composite index and telling it that when you're loading this or when you're organizing this data, organize it together with the job role. So you find the output looks like this. So the age is sorted properly in ascending order and comes out with the job role as well. So I'm able to see the youngest age is actually a driver. The third, so that's basically what how you implement composite index. The third one is a unique index, which is very, very important. The work of the the unique index is to index a particular property so that it ensures there are no duplicate values. So let's say we have a collection, a list of records like this one. If you can see, there is a first record and the last record. They both share the same email. And in this case, if it was a process of registration in a system, this shouldn't be allowed. So what you do, you add a unique index on the email property so that whenever Matthew decides to enter or register themselves with the email that belongs to Joe, it should fail. That means the data should remain at this state. It should not allow this record to be inserted. And the last index is a case-sensitive index. By default, Isar sets all strings and lists as case-sensitive. And you'll find that in the situations where you'd want to remove the case sensitivity, maybe you're searching for something and the name is correct, but just because of the case sensitivity, it won't return a record. For example, in this case, in an Isar database, a record like this one, if I decide to search Joe with a small j, it will return for me 0 records. But I might want to be able to pass Joe with capital J or small j and still return for me a record. For you to do that, you have to implement the case sensitive index on this user property so that you can be able to get records whether it's in capital J or in small j. So basically, those are the 4 indexes that we're actually going to use in our project. Now let's head over to the project and implement these indexes on our collections. So for our default index, we're going to use it on the routine collection. So for our default index, we want to use we want to implement it on the start time property where we want our routines to be arranged through time, using time in a certain order, using the time itself. So for us to actually set that unique, to set the index, we say at index. Basically, that's what you do, and it will be automatically set on this start time. So you'll find records will be arranged according to the start time or the time itself. So that's basically how default index works. It looks quite simple. The records themselves, will be able to see them once we start representing or displaying the records that have already been stored in the Isar database on the app. The second one is a composite index. In our case, we'll use the same routine collection, but we'll be focusing on title and category because they're the two that look, they're more related together. I might have a title like send emails in a category of work. So there's something about, I would like to, when categories are displayed, I'm able to see some of the routines in that category. So this is using a composite. I can't use an index because it depends on only one property, but because I want to see 2 properties, I can use a composite index to actually do that. So how we do that is we say at index composite, and then we set an array. We say composite index, and then we add the title or the name of the property in form of string. And that's all you do. So in default, whenever we are actually displaying or we want to get a display of this information, it will be displaying the category together with the title, so you're able to compare the two. So I think for composite index, it really works when it's relatable properties that you want to relate with. For example, in our case, if you look at the composite, the example we gave, it's nice to actually compare the age and the job role. You're able to see, okay, around the age of 28 and 30, most this in the records, it's mainly chefs and lawyers and something like that. So you're able to compare depending on the data set you are interested in. So the third one is a unique index. And for the unique index, we'll go to the category collection now. The reason why we chose this is because we don't want users to be adding categories, to be adding duplicate categories into the category collection, right? So we don't want a user to add work category and add work category again, and it's still recorded. So we want to set the name unique so that if somebody enters work again, they're told it already exists or something like that. So how to do that? We say at index unique true. Basically that's all you do, and it will be set on the category name itself. And the last index in our case is this case sensitive index. So in our two collections, the property that seemed fit was day, because if I want to search by day, and if I put Monday capital M or Monday small m, I want it to still be able to pass out the records for that day. So for me to do that, I say at index case sensitive false. The reason why we're saying false is that by default, Isar database sets strings and lists as case sensitive, but we don't want this one to be case sensitive. That's why we are setting it at false. So yeah, we are basically done with the 4 indexes for that we have actually presented, and it's pretty simple. It's a matter of understanding your data and what you actually want to how you want your collection to look like. Then it's just a matter of annotating the specific properties based on the type of index that you want. Now let's so that's about it. Next up, we'll start working on the next concept of Isar, which is linking collections. How do we link these two collections together? So that's what we're going to focus on. So don't forget to share and subscribe, and I'll see you on the next one.